And I'm struck with this fact. If you want two verses in the Bible which will change the whole scope of the way most churches work, wrongly in our opinion, and that is Acts 20, verses 24 and 25. I used to go about preaching the gospel of the grace of God. That's what he did, the gospel of the grace of God. If you don't know that that's the same as the gospel of the kingdom, you haven't got a hold of a very great key. So here's an enormous key. In Acts 20, verses 25, next verse after 24, Paul said, what I was doing was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. You're a very rare person if you understand that. The gospel of the kingdom is the same exactly as the gospel of grace. I'll tell you why it's gracious of God, because he wants to give you the kingdom. So we've been in the habit Sunday by Sunday, starting with Jeremiah 27, verse 5, which says that God made the trees and the bees and the flowers and everything in this marvelous creation we see through the window here, and he wants to give it, the whole thing, to those who are pleasing in his sight. What? How would you like to have the world as a present from God? That's what you're in Christianity for. He's going to reward you by giving you the whole thing, and you're going to take charge of it. And I woke up this morning thinking of this extraordinary verse in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2. Paul was very upset with his congregants there. They were being very slow. He said, don't you know that evil people will not inherit the kingdom? Have you forgotten that? Then he said, don't you know that the saints are going to manage the world? What? He didn't teach me that in church. So, have you grasped the fact that in 1 Corinthians 6:2, Paul says, don't you know, he said in exasperation, because they were having squabbles in the church, even taking each other to a law court to settle their differences. Paul was outraged by that. You idiots, he would have said. You unwise people. Tame it a little bit, make it kinder. Don't you know the saints are going to govern the world? What? I hope you're telling your friends about that, because that's astonishing. Yes, that's what it says. The saints, that's to say the true Christians of all the ages, including Abraham, who is the father of the faithful, are going to manage the world. Well, if you turn on your news on the television, what do they talk about? Governors. Who's going to fix the mess? Who's going to settle the disputes? I'll tell you who's going to do it. God using Jesus, using you. Don't you know the saints are going to manage the world? That's exactly the same as Isaiah 2, which speaks of God settling, using Jesus. He's going to settle the disputes among the nations. Isn't that amazing? Why don't the television stations talk about that? They don't know about that. It's your business to share that with them. The ultimate solution is the governorship, the rulership of Jesus in his kingdom. So we are not mistaken when we talk about the kingdom of God all the time. I want to give you one brief quote before we get to Ephesians. Quote from F.C. Grant in a book called The Gospel of the Kingdom. It may be said that the teaching of Jesus concerning the kingdom of God represents his whole teaching. It is the main determinative subject of all his discourse. His ethics were ethics of the kingdom. His theology was theology of the kingdom. His teaching regarding himself cannot be understood apart from his interpretation of the kingdom of God. And it may not only be said that all his teaching had relation to the kingdom, but also all of his action, everything he did, from the day of his baptism onward, all the events of his life until the final culminating event, the crucifixion, had reference to the coming kingdom. From his baptism on, Jesus' whole life was dedicated to the mission of announcing the approach of the kingdom and calling on men and women everywhere to prepare for entering the kingdom on the conditions which by divine authority announced. That is true. If your pastor doesn't talk about the kingdom of God all the time, you might very kindly suggest to him, he doesn't sound like Jesus. Jesus spoke about the kingdom because he knew that would be peace on earth, a time when the nations would settle their differences under compulsion from the Messiah ruling, and you ruling too. Oh, if I can just be there and hold the door for 1,000 years, don't even say it. Your talent is much too valuable for just holding the door for 1,000 years. And what you're going through now in the way of difficulties, Acts 14:22, through much difficulty, through much tribulation, we're destined to enter the kingdom. It's all about the kingdom. Now, this is wrong. Everything we're saying is wrong. If this is right, it's rather huge. If only because most people don't understand this very well. So your job is to help fill in the gap there and tell them about the kingdom of God gospel.